All right, so ready to dive into the Grammys.
Let's do it.
Okay, cool. I'm thinking we should focus on two really interesting years, 2010 and 2020, kind of compare and contrast, see how things have evolved over that decade.
Yeah, sounds fascinating.
So much can change in music in just 10 years.
Right. Absolutely. Like what trends were big, what kind of music was winning awards, who were the breakout stars. It's going to be interesting to see the parallels and the differences.
Totally. Okay, so let's start with 2020. I feel like we got to talk about Billie Eilish, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, she swept the major categories: Album of the Year, Record of the Year, Song of the Year, and Best New Artist.
Crazy. I mean, wasn't that the first time anyone did that since like Christopher Cross back in the 80s?
Yeah, you're right. In the 1981 to be exact. It was a huge deal. Like people were comparing her to like Adele and Mariah Carey, who also won Best New Artist early in their career.
Oh, wow. So that category really does seem to predict future success, huh?
It's a pretty good indicator.
Okay, so Eilish definitely dominated 2020. But I'm curious what other albums were nominated for Album of the Year.
Well, alongside Eilish, there was Lana Del Rey with Norman Fing Rockwell. That was a big one.
Yeah, I remember that album.
And Bon Iver with I, and Ariana Grande's Thank You, next.
So many big names.
Oh, and can't forget Vampire Weekend with Father of the Bride. Quite a diverse lineup.
Yeah, it really was. Do you think that reflects how people were listening to music in 2020? Like with streaming and all?
I think so, yeah. With streaming, playlists are introducing people to all kinds of genres they might not have listened to before, so maybe that's why the nominations felt so diverse.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on to Record of the Year. Eilish won that one too, right? For Bad Guy.
She did, but the competition was tough. Like Lizzo was nominated for Truth Hurts.
Oh yeah, that was a massive hit.
And then Lil Nas X with Old Town Road featuring Billy Ray Cyrus.
Oh man, that song was everywhere.
Yeah, it was a phenomenon. Kind of controversial too.
Yeah, I remember that. Some country music fans were not happy.
But it won Best Music Video at the Grammys, so clearly it had a huge cultural impact.
It did, for sure. Before we go on though, can you remind me what exactly is the difference between Record of the Year and Song of the Year?
Good question. Song of the Year recognizes the songwriter, like the lyrics and the melody. But Record of the Year, it's about the recording itself, like the performance, the production, the whole sonic experience.
Oh, okay, got it. Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah.
So besides Lizzo and Lil Nas X, who else was up for Record of the Year?
Well, you also had Ariana Grande with Seven Rings, another big hit, and then HER with Hard Place, such a soulful ballad.
Man, 2020 was a good year for music.
Yeah.
Okay, last category for 2020, Song of the Year. And Eilish won this one too, right?
Yes, she did, for Bad Guy. It was quite a night for her.
So who else was she up against for Song of the Year?
Well, Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper were nominated for Shallow from A Star is Born. That was a big contender.
Oh yeah, for sure. I love that movie.
Then there was Louis Capaldi with Someone You Love, Taylor Swift with Lover.
Swift is just always there, isn't she?
Just like it.
Mm-hmm.
And to round out the nominees, we had Tanya Tucker with Bring My Flowers Now.
What a range of styles and emotions.
Yeah.
I mean, from Taylor Swift to Tanya Tucker. It's pretty amazing. Okay, so we've covered 2020 in detail. Now let's rewind a decade and go back to the 2010 Grammys. I feel like that was a whole different world.
Totally. 2010 was like the dawn of social media. Streaming was just starting to take off, and we were coming out of a recession. So definitely a different vibe.
Yeah, it really was. So who are the big contenders for Album of the Year back then?
Well, Taylor Swift won that year for Fearless.
Oh, wow. So that was her first big Grammy win.
One of her first big wins.
Yeah.
And it was a sign of things to come. She was transitioning from country to pop, and Fearless kind of solidified her as a global star.
Interesting. So who else was nominated alongside her?
Let's see. We had Beyonce with I Am Sasha Fierce, the Black Eyed Peas with the END, Lady Gaga with the Fame.
Whoa, so many iconic albums.
Right. And last but not least, the Dave Matthews Band with Big Whiskey and the Gruget's King.
Wow. What a mix. It's like pop was huge, but there's also hip-hop rock, even a jam band in there.
Yeah.
Pretty diverse.
I think that reflects the musical landscape of 2010.
Yeah.
You know, pop was still dominant, but hip-hop was gaining momentum. And artists like Lady Gaga were kind of pushing the boundaries of what pop could be.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, on to Record of the Year for 2010. Who took home the prize?
Beyonce won that year for Single Ladies. Put a ring on it.
Oh, man. What a song.
Iconic. Right, and the video, too. Everyone was trying to learn that dance.
It was a cultural moment for sure. Okay, so who else was nominated?
The Black Eyed Peas were up for Boom Boom Pow.
Yeah.
And Kings of Leon for You Somebody.
Both great songs.
And, of course, Lady Gaga for Poker Face.
She was unstoppable that year.
Yeah, she was everywhere. And then last but not least, Taylor Swift with You Belong With Me.
Wow, what a lineup. It's like each of those songs brings back such specific memories of 2010. Okay, last category, Song of the Year. Who won that one?
Kings of Leon won for Use Somebody.
Nice.
Yeah, it's a really powerful song. It resonated with a lot of people, but the competition was tough. Like, Beyonce was nominated for Halo.
Oh, yeah. That's one of my favorites from her.
Beautiful song. And then Lady Gaga was up for Poker Face again.
Seriously, she was everywhere that year.
Yeah, Poker Face was huge. And then Maxwell was nominated for Pretty Wings.
Oh, I love that song.
So smooth and soulful. And finally, rounding out the nominees, Taylor Swift with You Belong With Me Again.
It's interesting how certain themes just keep coming up. Love, heartbreak, longing for connection. It's like those emotions are timeless.
You're right. Music has a way of tapping into those universal experiences. Okay, so we've covered both 2020 and 2010. Now comes the fun part, comparing these two musical snapshots. What jumps out at you when you think about these two Grammy years side by side?
Well, one thing that strikes me is how much hip-hop and R&B have come to the forefront.
Yeah.
Like in 2020, artists like Lil Nas X, H.E.R., they weren't just nominated, they were winning.
Yeah, that's a big shift from 2010, where it was mostly pop rock and country dominating the awards.
Totally. It's like hip-hop went from being present to being the main event.
And I think that says a lot about how culture has changed over the past decade.
For sure. Okay, so we've got a lot to dig into here. The rise of hip-hop, the impact of streaming, the changing role of social media. It's going to be fascinating to see how all these factors shape the music of both 2010 and 2020.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive deeper.
Me too.
Okay, so where were we?
I think we were about to really get into comparing 2010 and 2020. Like what shifted, what stayed the same.
Right. It's like looking at two different snapshots of the music world.
Exactly. So besides hip-hop becoming more prominent, what else stands out to you?
I think the impact of streaming is huge GE. Like in 2010, streaming was just starting to take off, but by 2020, it completely transformed how people consume music.
Yeah, it's true. It's like back in 2010, we were still buying CDs and downloading songs on iTunes.
Yeah, and radio play was still super important for an artist's success, but by 2020, it was all about playlists, algorithms going viral on TikTok.
Oh, yeah, totally. It's like the gatekeepers had less power and artists could connect with their audiences more directly.
Exactly, and that's probably one of the reasons why we saw so much more diversity in the 2020 Grammy nominations.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Like with streaming, people are exposed to so many different genres and artists.
It's like musical boundaries started to blur.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so streaming definitely played a huge role. But what about social media? How did that impact the music of these 2 years?
Oh man, social media changed everything. Like in 2010, social media was still pretty new. Facebook was around, but Instagram and TikTok didn't even exist.
It's crazy to think about that now.
Yeah.
Like, how did artists even promote their music back then?
It was a lot more traditional, press releases, radio interviews, magazine features. But by 2020, social media had become this essential tool for artists to build their brand, connect with fans, and even control their own narrative.
Yeah, I mean, look at Lil Nas X, Old Town Road, went viral on TikTok, and then it became this global phenomenon.
Exactly. It's like social media gave artists this whole new way to break through and find their audience.
And it also gave fans a way to interact with artists in a way that was never possible before.
Yeah, it's like the relationship between artist and fan became much more direct and personal.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked about hip-hop streaming social media. What else stands out to you when you compare 2010 and 2020?
I think it's interesting how both years reflect this yearning for authenticity and connection, but they express it in different ways.
That's interesting. Tell me more about that.
Okay, so in 2010, we were emerging from a recession. Social media was still new, and I think there was this sense of optimism mixed with uncertainty. Like people were looking for a sense of belonging.
And how did that show up in the music?
Well, think about songs like Use Somebody by Kings of Leon or You Belong With Me by Taylor Swift. These songs are all about longing for connection, finding your place in the world.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like they captured the mood of that time.
And then fast forward to 2020, we're facing a global pandemic, social unrest, a lot of division and anxiety.
Definitely a very different world.
Right. And I think in 2020, the need for authenticity and connection became even more intense. It was less about fitting in and more about embracing your true self.
And that's where artists like Billie Eilish, Lizzo, and H.E.R. come in.
Exactly. They weren't afraid to be vulnerable, to talk about their struggles, and to celebrate their individuality. And that resonated with so many people.
It's like their music provided a sense of solace and empowerment in a time when people really needed it.
Exactly. It's like music was a mirror reflecting the hopes and fears of each era.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. But before we move on, I want to touch on one more thing, the role of the singer-songwriter. It felt like in 2020, there was a real emphasis on artists who were writing, producing, and often playing multiple instruments on their tracks.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Like artists like Billie Eilish, Phineas, H.E.R., they were really hands-on with their music. It was like a return to that DIY spirit.
Exactly. And it felt like that independent spirit really came through in their music. Like there was so much experimentation, so much genre bending.
I think technology played a big role in that too. Like with home studios and digital distribution, it's easier than ever for artists to create and release their music on their own terms.
That's so true. And it's really empowering for artists.
Totally. It's like they're not beholden to the traditional industry model anymore.
Okay, so we've talked about the rise of hip hop, the impact of streaming social media, the DIY spirit of singer-songwriters. What else? Is there anything we've missed in our comparison of 2010 and 2020?
You know what? Even with all these changes, some things remain timeless. Like a good song, a catchy melody, a heartfelt lyric. These elements will always have the power to move people.
You're so right. And we see that with artists like Taylor Swift, who won Album of the Year in both 2010 and 2020.
Exactly. She's a master storyteller, and her music has resonated with people across different eras and genres.
She's definitely a force to be reckoned with. And speaking of iconic artists, we got to mention Beyonce.
Oh, yeah, Queen Bey. She was killing it in both 2010 and 2020.
From Single Ladies to Black Parade, she's always pushing creative boundaries and using her platform to make a difference.
Absolutely. She's a true icon.
Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of ground in our comparison of 2010 and 2020. We've seen how music has evolved, how technology has changed the game, and how certain themes like the desire for authenticity and connection continue to resonate with listeners.
It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has. Now, before we wrap up, I think we promised our listeners some album recommendations.
Oh, yeah. I'm ready to share some sonic treasures.
Me too. Let's do it.
All right, so album recommendations. Hit me with yours first.
Okay, for 2020, I'm going to go with Punisher by Phoebe Bridgers.
Oh, good one.
Yeah, it's just such a beautiful album. I don't know how to describe it. It's just really like melancholic and introspective, but also like hopeful in a way.
Yeah.
It really captures the vibe of 2020, I think.
Yeah, her songwriting is amazing. She's like, I don't know, she's just got a way with words.
Totally. Okay, your turn. What about 2010?
Okay, 2010 none. This is tough. There are so many good ones, but I'm going to go with The Archandroid by Janelle Monáe.
Oh, yeah, that's a great choice.
I just love how ambitious it is. Like, it's a concept album, and it's just so creative and, like, genre-bending. It's got funk, soul rock, even a little bit of classical music in there.
Yeah, I remember when that album came out, it was just so different from everything else that was happening at the time.
Totally. And Janelle Monáe is just such a visionary artist.
She is, for sure. Okay, so we've got 2 great album recommendations for our listeners. But this is just scratching the surface, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's so much more music out there to discover from both 2010 and 2020.
That's the truth. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Grammys, what's like the one big takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I think the big takeaway is that music is always evolving. You know, what was popular in 2010 is different from what was popular in 2020. But the power of music to connect with us, to make us feel things, to tell stories, that never goes away.
I totally agree. Like, the Grammys are fun to talk about, but ultimately it's about experiencing the music itself, you know, finding the songs and artists that speak to you personally.
Yeah, for sure. So to our listeners, keep exploring, keep listening, and you never know what you might discover.
That's what makes it so exciting, right?
Absolutely.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this sonic adventure through the Grammys.
It was my pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, happy listening.